Welcome you to.
C'est pas si caméra. Ah, c'est bon.
Est-ce que Camille, est-ce que tu enregistres?
Oui.
Okay, so I welcome you to Montreal. I can't show it to you right now. It's behind me in a real scene, but I had to turn off my face. And I hereby pass it to you. Announce your topic in English. I won't do the French introduction because we've lost too much time. Okay. Mm-hmm. And you said you're willing to take questions during your presentation. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct, especially if they are questions concerning the understanding of what I'm saying, of course. Please don't hesitate to immediately ask or raise your hand. I hope I can see it, or maybe even turn on the microphone so you can ask questions in between.
Once it becomes, I'll tell to the people in the audience that since Chris is willing to take, you are willing to take questions in your presentation, am I right or not?
Yes, of course.
So say it aloud, because I can't turn your faces on and I can't see that your hands are raised. This will be fixed, I think, next week, but we just had a change in management. So, Chris, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Yeah, I've been at a couple of presentations at this seminar series. It's been a really great series. I must say, this has been really interesting talks, great discussions, and I'm happy to contribute something to the discussion today. Looking forward to it. So first, I want to talk about large language models, of course, and how they deal with meaning and language. And usually large language models are considered in terms of a black box, like we often do with artificial intelligence. We think that really what is in that black box is too complicated to really understand. So we just consider the input and the output, and like in the Turing test, can infer from that what that technology is capable of doing and consider what it will do to us and our world. Now, when we look into that box, then sometimes, as we have seen last week, for instance, people compare what's going on in that model to the human brain. So they kind of think there's a kind of brain in that box. It's, of course, an artificial brain, but it is something, an artificial neural network that relates to the human network. And we can ask, how does it relate to the human brain, and what similarities are there, what differences, how does it operate in that neuronal terms? So I think there's something problematic about that, about comparing AI and human intelligence, even though the name already suggests a direct comparison, right? Artificial intelligence seems to be something like natural intelligence, just artificial. But I think that that this direct comparison of AI and human intelligence often leads astray. So I think when we look at the large language model, we shouldn't primarily think of this in terms of brain-like thing, but rather consider how it was trained, what goes into that. And actually, yesterday I asked a large language model to provide me a picture of that. So this is what it is. There's a huge text corpus that goes into that black box, which we can open. And of course, like in that black box, there would be lots of parameters and lots of numbers and relations, not books, but this is what goes into that large language model. So I think this might be something to consider more. So my first point I want to make today is that the training data are key to the capabilities of large language models. And those training data, of course, are the text corpus that goes in there. So the text corpus models aspects of language use. And that language use is conscious, in large part at least, and it is used in the word. So every word here is important. Now, I think that in that text corpus, there are symbols, of course, and they scaffold language use. So I'll explain what that means. They help us in our language use. They don't just mirror the word, but they are part of our language use.
Let me use my prerogative to ask you a question. That conscious. What is conscious of what? And what do you mean by conscious?
So I don't want to reduce consciousness to just a kind of koala or something that is divorced from the word. I think that conscious is a way of being aware in the word, of experiencing the word, maybe an experience, perspective on the word. So it's our kind of being in the word. So I'm not making a claim here that there's something kind of mysterious, magical, something like consciousness was outside of the word. It's a way of us experiencing the word. Does that answer your question?
To that at the end, maybe.
Yes. Let's come back to that on that point, because I think conscious language use is important for language, that we associate something with the words and that we experience our way through language, but it's not like an argument for something that cannot be captured in language or something like that. So symbols scaffold language use. And I also think, and that might be interesting for Stephen, or maybe challenge also, or provoke probably a reaction, I think, that symbols are grounded by language use. Now, I'm not saying that there couldn't be more to grounding, of course, but through language use, they become grounded. What does give rise to the possibilities of large language models? I think that they take out statistical patterns, and by doing so, they model patterns of language use. So again, language use is really important here. So let's come to the first point, and if there are questions, please ask them on when we're talking about those points, or at the end, of course. I hope there will be a good discussion. I'm pretty sure. So the training data are key to the capabilities of large language models. What does that mean? I already said, refer to Turing. I think the passing of the Turing test now seems to be in reach. It seems as if large language models were able to produce texts that really looks like written by humans, or resembles so much enough that we can imagine that the Turing test will be passed very soon in the limits of a reasonable test, and by a jury that, of course, has more or less understanding of what, or has a grasp on what to ask and how to figure out what there is. So probably, I think, in the wild, so to say, the Turing test already has been passed. People have been already pretty confused by large language models and speculated that they might be either understanding language, and there are researchers claiming exactly that in the field, or even have sentience. And there are people working on large language models who claim exactly that. On the other hand, of course, there are those who say that large language models cannot understand for principal reasons. So John Searle's argument, of course, from the Chinese room comes into mind, where he said that syntax does not amount to semantics. And a new form of that argument is being put forward by Bender and Collar recently, to say that a system exposed only to form in its training cannot in principle learn meaning. And they mean a large language model here. So there are these different perspectives, and they talk about understanding. Can those understand or not? Which, in my view, is a rather ambiguous question, which has to do that understanding is not very clearly defined. So understanding appears to be one-dimensional. It appears to be in the mind and expresses in behavior, of course. But I think this is just one way of thinking of understanding, that it is in the mind. And I think it's problematic. I think that understanding really is multi-dimensional. So there are many aspects to understanding. We can understand a situation, for instance. It doesn't need to be in language. We could think of an animal that doesn't really have a language, or not in our terms, and nevertheless understands the situation, or maybe the affordances provided by the situation. We can also understand moral demands, something that we perceive as being put forward to us, maybe by others, or the way how we interpret a situation, something that is also not like an understanding of text in the classical sense. Of course, we can also understand spoken language, or we can understand written text. And that is what we usually think when we talk about understanding. But I think understanding has more to it. It's not that narrow just on text or interpreting text. And even when it comes to text, there are different ways of understanding a text. We can think of the meaning of the words of a text, or of that text altogether. Maybe a scientific text, maybe a poem. That would be quite different. What does it mean to understand a poem? It's possible to talk about understanding there, of course. Now, we can understand the intention of an author, the implications of a text, and there's so many ways of understanding. Also, understanding is always only partial. We can always understand something better. So I can say, yeah, I totally understand what you mean, and I can mean that, and it's kind of truthful, but the understanding can always be improved over time, and it might turn out that my understanding was merely preliminary or even wrong. So I think understanding can mean many different things. And we tend to think of understanding as something rather narrow when it comes to humans, and we're more generous, I think, when it comes to machines. So we can think of a human who tries to solve a task, and looks at the sheet of the neighbor and gets there the understanding, or we wouldn't say it's really understanding, it's just copying from the neighbor. With regards to machines, I think we do not look as much as or we don't wonder as much about how they produce something, but admit that there can be different ways, which might be less the case for humans. So I think, like with intelligence, the concept is used in different ways, and that is very problematic for that question. So I think it's also a very broad question. Do machines understand or not? It seems something like we could answer in an easy way, as yes or no, but I think it's rather difficult, problematic there. I suggest a clearer question rather than asking, do machines, or in this case, large language models, understand? I want to ask, how can large language models use sets of symbols to produce text that is meaningful to humans? So I think that is something we can ask with regard to large language models, and that really helps us understanding what this technology is able to do.
But you realize that in taking that criterion, instead of what we would have normally taken, we were talking about the understanding in the heads of users and not the understanding in the device. You just transferred it to that. It's no longer a question about whether does the device understand. It's about whether we, the users, understand what the device is putting out.
Yes, and how the device is getting us to understand what it is, or producing a text that makes sense to us.
Yeah,
that is really helpful.
But it makes sense to us is our understanding, not its understanding.
Exactly.
Okay,
So go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah.
So yes, this is really right. The understanding is in us there, or it's only due to our contribution. It's not just like in the machine somewhere in that apparatus. So I think that that's important. Thank you. So the training data, it consists of very large amounts of text, of course, huge amounts, everything that can grasp, that's digitized and that's on the internet or somehow available to the companies. And the question then is, what in the text corpora allows large language models to extract those parameters that enable them to produce text that sounds as if it had been written by a human being? So I think that the question of understanding in the machine doesn't really make sense, but it does something that really contributes to human understanding, and it does something that makes sense to us at least. And what is it in that text corpus that is extracted by those models that then allows to produce a text that really makes sense? So I think we shouldn't think of the machine in human-like terms as something that has an understanding, reflects on the question, and then puts out a text that then makes sense to us, but rather to think of it as something that manipulates symbols by means of statistics in an artificial neural net, and that then produces something that makes sense to us. So it always works in the context of our language, of our word, and it integrates what it gets from the text corpus in our word. But what is it in that text corpus that allows a large language model to do that, right? There's something that is captured, so to say, in that text corpus that we can then statistically manipulate and get out, and which makes sense to us. So this is the second point. The text corpora model aspects of conscious language use in the word. And what does that mean? What are those text corpora doing? So the text corpora used for training are encyclopedias, web pages, books, chats, transcripts of spoken language, everything they can get. So that's a lot. It seems to be huge. It seems to be like all the knowledge of the word in those text corpora. But on the other hand, it is really narrow. There's only a very partial understanding in all of that, or maybe we shouldn't speak of understanding, sorry. We should speak here of something that can be used to get understanding. So there's written language. Most of the language we use is spoken, and it's not even in the text corpora. So most of the language used in humanities time is not in those text corpora. Though, of course, there are sometimes transcripts of spoken language. And yeah, that can be also a problem now when there's text produced by large language models, for instance, that then also becomes part of the text corpora. The context here is also important because context can be gathered from statistical relations, but that is only one part of the context. When we are in a situation, there's a lot of context, and language is always context dependent. So that is an important point also Stefan made, that there is something a context that needs to be somehow, that goes beyond the symbols, and that somehow needs to be taken into account for making sense of language. But large language models use context only in that sense of statistical relations between words. So the text corpora, they do not just model language, I think, but language use. And that is important. So language is not just a system of relations between words, but the text corpora contain language that is used on the internet for certain purposes in the context of certain websites, for instance, or under the headings in encyclopedia, or in manifold ways. So there's a language use really that takes place there, and not just like maybe earlier forms of AI, symbolic AI, try to consider just a system of static relations. So that language use needs to be understood, or what is involved in language use to make sense of what's in the text corpus. So distribution in a text corpus, that is something that is often considered, and there is even distributional semantics. Usually people claim that really the relations between words, statistical relations, amount to meaning, but I think that the language consists of many language games and interactions in the word, and they are able to, or this way we're able to make sense. So there's always a context in there. So language use is something that happens in the word. It does involve symbols, and it does involve mental activity, maybe not always. Maybe there could be some unconscious production of text or understanding under anesthesia, but I think usually language use is more or less conscious. So I don't want to say this is an on-off thing either. I think there's a lot of language use that is only partial, or that there's only partial awareness when we use language. Often language is used in mechanical ways, automatically, so to say. There is some awareness in there, but actually lots of language use is not that reflective, not very elaborated, and that I think is something about human language use, which is maybe aggravated by language that is produced by large language models.
Okay,
So,
I have to do another one. It's the same thing. It's the same point, and it'll come back over and over. We're talking about understanding. Are you talking about the understanding in the head of the users, or are you talking about understanding in the device?
I'm talking about understanding by humans.
Okay, so the consciousness you're talking about here now is not a consciousness of the device. And before, when you mentioned consciousness, were you also talking about the human users and not about the device?
Yes. I'm thinking about human language use. So machines also can take part in language use, but it's only part. And I think of language use as something that always happens in a situation. It happens in the world. And by world here, I don't mean just the physical world, but I mean the world we understand, we live in. So maybe it's the life world. We could call it the life world. And it is the surrounding what embeds our understanding.
I have a question from Anna Strasser. Go ahead, please, Anna.
Thank you. But you said something before you talking about the human language use that I understood that you would say that the large language model would need to understand what is involved in human language use. So you just used the word understand, and so I'm a little bit confused. Because if we look at the thing, what is happening in the black box, and if this is sort of not only the distribution in the text corpus, but also emerge something about an understanding of the human language use of human language games, do you exclude this? And so I misunderstood you, or would you say in the end, there is something what we could call understanding if a large language model would show us that they understand something what is involved in human language use?
Yeah, thank you. great question. So I think understanding can be used in different ways. The concept of understanding is something that is used in different ways. So I would say in the strict sense, large language models do not understand, but I think we can talk of them of understanding in certain restricted ways. So I could say let's say translation machine understands. I meant the word bank as something I'm going to do a transfer, to wire something, and not the bank I'm sitting on. So in that sense, we can say, well, it grasps that concept, so or it grasps what I wanted to say, and it does the right translation. So it's understanding what I wanted to say. But I don't think this really amounts to an understanding of what we think is the case, or how we would think of understanding with humans. It's a mere kind of, in this case, gathering of the context or of the likelihoods of words occurring with each other and producing something that we can then say, well, it did understand what I'm saying, but yeah, in that very limited sense. I hope that made it a little clearer.
Yeah, thank you. And it's still an open question whether the text corpus by which it's trained gives the language model enough information to understand in this very limited way anything about human language uses in the real world.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it gives only a part, or it contributes part of human language use, which are it can gather parts of that, and those are statistical forms, or maybe the contours of language use, and those can be taken out by large language models and used for new calculations. And that is something that has part in understanding. It is not understanding by itself, but it becomes part of our use, and it can become part of our world in that sense. And there we could say it understands, or it has part in our understanding, not that it understands like a human would understand. So I think large language models, they model the part of the use of language that is represented in their training data, of course, but only that part that can be taken out by statistical means. So what is important is to investigate not just the statistical relation between words, like distributional semantics would do, which is important, but it's also important to look at how we experience language, that is, how we understand language, but also produce language in a human-like way in the context of our shared world. So I think we need to abstract from the typical theories of meaning that are classically out there. So I think representational theories of meaning are, well, there are many different kinds of representational theories of meaning, of course, and they all have differences, but maybe this is a very easy scheme, simplified. There's the word, and that is referred to by meaning. So meaning represents the word, and symbols represent meaning. So there's a relation between symbols and word mediated by meaning. And that is a classical theory of meaning, or maybe at least widespread theory of meaning. And I want to say, well, this is too abstract. We really need to look at the text corpus and what is in that text corpus. And as I said, in the text corpus is not just meaning and relations between words, but there's a use captured in that text corpus. So the idea of meaning as use, of course, is something that is usually attributed to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein thinks that, or presents an account of language use as something that shows how we think of or how we make sense in our exchanges in language games. So the usual citation by Wittgenstein that is taken out in this context is where he says that for a large class of cases of the employment of the word meaning, though not for all, this word can be explained in this way. The meaning of a word is its use in a language. And the meaning of the name is sometimes explained by pointing to its bearer. So the meaning of a name, that of course is like the classical theory of meaning, where we think of meaning basically like naming. There's something that is named in the word. Maybe the early Wittgenstein is a candidate for such a theory, where we think that like language basically is a picture of the word, and it names the word or things in the word, and then their logical relations to each other. So Wittgenstein admits that sometimes the meaning of a name is explained in this way. So yes, we can sometimes explain meaning that way. It doesn't say, though, that this is what meaning is, right? It just says that this is how we sometimes explain the meaning of a name. That is the language game we're playing there. And it's a way of explaining the use of a name, which makes sense. But usually, it says, at least for a large class of cases of the employment of the word meaning, we can say meaning is a use in language. So he's not concerned with just meaning by itself and some kind of Platonic ideal word, but he is concerned with how meaning is used, how the word can be explained, not just what meaning in itself is. So he doesn't try to propose a theory here. He tries to explain how we use that word. So here the use too is in the center of the investigation. And I think that we can conceive of meaning as use not as like something that is independent, not as if meaning was something that is additionally there in some other space in addition to use, but that is just arising from use, or that is part of our sense making of the word. So it's not a word we can throw out, but it's not something we should reify too much as something that has its own kind of existence.
What about what something that's a little less exalted than meaning, like reference? Apple refers to those red round things out there which I can recognize and eat. How does that fit into this?
Mm-hmm. We can refer with words. We can refer to things in the word, of course. It does make.
How do you fit that into Wittgenstein's quote here? This one.
Where we use the word apple to refer to things in the word which we can eat, and we make sense of that word because it is used in this in that way.
But you said, or Wittgenstein said, the meaning of a name, the name of an apple, is sometimes explained by pointing to its bearer. Is the bearer the one who says apple, or the apple?
Mm-hmm. I don't think that Wittgenstein would be opposed to saying that sometimes words name things. I think this name is probably what he thinks here is more like a proper name, something that refers to a person, or maybe a certain thing, Mount Everest or what you have. And apple is, of course, a general term, and that has a cultural context and very much plays a role. I think persons are kind of particular because we have a very strict understanding of what a person is, or a human being. There are laws, and we have a rather certain idea of what a human being amounts to. It might change when there's more genetical manipulation. And there's some discussions, of course, when does a human being come to existence and when not. But it's rather easy to refer to a human being and say that human being, and it seems like a rigid designator. And so naming is like a classical, or it's maybe the paradigm case of the classical theory of meaning. But I think that works pretty well for names because we have rather rigid idea of what names are, but it doesn't necessarily work for all concepts. And I think that they're actually, for most concepts, it's not that easy.
I asked only what is meant by bearer. Is the bearer that is referred to in that passage the apple or the one who says apple?
Or the bearer would be, I would think the bearer means like the apple or the person in the word.
No, you can't say it's or the apple. Or, okay, we're not referring to persons, we're referring to apples. So forget about Kripke and all that stuff in philosophy. I say apple. I'm referring to apple. I want to say something less than meaning. I'm just referring to those red round things that we all know. And what you mean by bearer is those red round things, not me referring to those red round things.
Yeah, we refer to the thing in the word.
Okay, thank you. That's all I wanted.
At least in my interpretation of Wittgenstein. So what do I mean by symbols scaffolding language use, right? Helping us using language. So that is the third point, symbols scaffold language use. So I think scaffolding can have multiple uses, can scaffold in interaction with others, which I think is something rather, originally, or where language originally was what it is originally used for, and that is actually used in most times we use language for interaction, but also it could be for sense making, something more abstract, even if we want to. And it can be also, symbols can also scaffold thought, even emotions. They give a certain way to to perceive the world, to react in emotional ways that suggest us certain paths, so to say. We can follow, but maybe not have to. So I don't think language determines what we can think, but it gives hints, it gives suggestions, and we can only continue in certain ways. So once we started a sentence, we cannot digress in all kinds of ways. We need to continue with how we started that line of thought. And their language kind of limits us, but it also enables us to continue and to explain things. So it's a scaffold for us to make sense of the word and to go on in interactions, but also in thought, emotion, and perception. And symbols, of course, can be also used to replicate a living discourse, an exchange between people. And here we have a method that is writing that allows very well to replicate a lot of what was said in a situation, at least like the symbolic language part. So a lot of things we disregard, gesticulation, for instance, that is not part anymore of the living discourse, but other things that we regard as important are put in language. So writing is really important here, and writing is that what is in the text corpus, of course. So what is writing? Writing, traditionally, I think the first ways of writing were lists, lists of items, maybe that were shipped, or all kinds of lists to order what is in the word. If you think now of the internet, lists become really important again because yeah, the whole internet could be seen as a list. When we search something, we get a list of websites we refer to. So lists are really one important part of language use. But also we can use written language to tell stories, of course, or to make a contract, laws, to exchange messages, letters, to write books, and to transcribe speech. So there are many uses for text which are quite different, but which give us the impression that text is something that somehow is dissolved from like that usual context of language, and it has its own kind of realm of meaning. So text appears detached from use. It appears independent of sense making, detached from the context. There seems to be its own word of meaning, and it seems to stand in a representational relation to the word. While really what text does, it helps us scaffolding our language use. So I hurry up a little bit. Symbols are grounded by language use. What do I mean here? So language use, as said already, is embedded in the live world, and it involves thought, emotion, perception. And individual language games are part of larger language games in which they are embedded. And every one of these language games can be grounded by reference to other language games. Now, you could say, well, but this is only like symbols grounded in symbols. But what I think is that really language use is not just the exchange of symbols, but it is something embedded in the world we live in and grounded through that. So there's a reference to the word already given in language use. And symbols are part of that language use and grounded by that language use.
I still don't understand what you mean by grounding.
So here, I mean that the language or the symbols get their meaning by being embedded in the language use. So I don't say they're necessarily grounded in something external to language use, but I think that doesn't need to be the case for grounding, because symbols are embedded in the word already and in our use, which happens in the word. So I don't think here there needs to be an external reference to ground symbols.
Let's rather take the case where you do need an external reference, because it's super simple. Can we go back to my apple? If apple is grounded in those things out there, how?
Well, the apple is there in the word, or what do you mean there by?
How do I know it? I am an innocent gadget in the world. How do I know if when I say that's an apple, I mean an apple? How can I do that? Can ChatGPT do that?
Well, ChatGPT can, of course, simulate a lot of what you would do in the world, and it can pretend a lot of things, like pretending, of course, not like in the sense that it really wants to pretend or something, but that it can model a language use or parts of a language use that appears to us as understanding, but it is not really grounded in that sense, because it is not in that in the language use and in that complete way, at least. So it has part of our language use, but that language use in this case is grounded through humans who understand what these symbols in that language model mean, so or the output means. So the language model doesn't really is not really grounding anything there. I think the language model doesn't get out of the symbolic realm, so to say.
That sounds
But
like you're saying it's ungrounded after all.
I think the language model can only be grounded through its being embedded in this wider language use.
I don't know about embedding. I know ChatGPT. I can say to ChatGPT, you know what an apple is? Of course I know what an apple is. What is an apple? It's a round red fruit. Fine. Point to one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the language model couldn't point, right?
Sorry, I can't because I can't see. I have no hands, and so I have no, actually. All I told you was what I know about words about apples, not about apples.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, correct. So I agree. In that sense, the language model is ungrounded, and it does only make sense, and it's only grounded through this wider language use, and it is important that that language use is happening in the word, so the word takes part of that. So I think that is very important. I just don't think that the language use is something that can be departed from the word, so to say, and where just the reference alone gives grounding. But I think reference only exists in the context of a language use.
Okay.
I hope that's somewhat clear.
There's some questions over here. Say them
Hi, my name is
loud.
Yeah. My name is Matthew Gravel. I just want to make sure that I understood the last part of the conversation. If we take like the language use as also, let's say in a way binding like a function, the grounding that human does. Like if I refer to an apple, I know as a human being that it is the red round thing over there, and I'm going to describe it like that. What we're saying is we made it learn through language use the output of grounding that human would do. So it just stored the output itself to be able to say, okay, if I ask somebody that's human, he would say that. So that's what I'm going to say.
Okay, I'm not sure if I completely understood.
Question is,
What-
is the language model just doing, when people talk about apples, what people do, what people say when they talk about apples? Whereas we, right, can do a little bit more than that. We can actually see, recognize, and do things with the apple. And so the question is, what do you mean that apple is grounded in all of this other stuff in the world? What does that grounding mean? Because it sounds like it's missing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that it is being in that world and being able to deal with apples and eat apples and know what they are. I think the large language model it doesn't know in a strict sense of knowing, at least doesn't know any of that. It just is able to produce text that appears to us as being.
I think we all agree with you about that. The question is, if we've been talking about meaning in the world, I don't understand all this language, but anyway, real people are in the world, they talk about apples, they really mean apples, etc. About them, all of that stuff is true. But we're here talking about LLMs, and it seems like what we're hearing is that LLMs can't do that. Well, then, what?
Mm-hmm.
What? Why not has it? Okay, but okay.
Yeah. LLMs don't have that word. They're not embedded in the live world in the same sense. They are embedded through our use of them, of course. But what they do is take the statistical contours of our language use and reassemble them, so to say, according to certain according to the rules of the network or the statistical likelihoods that then enable the network to produce text which doesn't make sense for the network, but it does make sense to us because we are we are using language in that more entailing way.
Would you say the same thing about a book? A book doesn't understand anything. We do. So when we read a sentence about an apple, we embed it in the world. So what? So is ChatGPT like a book? And that's the end of the story?
No, because ChatGPT does more, of course. It does reassemble, so to say. It takes the input and makes a new output from the input. So the predictive model or the mechanism in there, so to say, works with the likelihoods in there, and it's very flexible and it's reactive. So there's a certain form of interaction which is given rise by that, which you don't have in a book, right? Books are dead, so to say. They need to be read. But also, in that sense, it's similar to a book in that what the output is not understood by the model. It's not understood by the book either. It is understood by the human who's reading the text output.
Yes, I want to come back to the notion of being grounded. As far as I understood, you claim language use in human societies is grounded because we are all embedded in the real world. So we can point to apples and all that stuff. And if we look on the production of text of a large language model, you would say it's not grounded in the same way because the large language model is not able to point on an apple. It's not embedded in our world. But you might also say it is grounded in a wider sense by humans making sense of the outputs. So if I would reformulate that, we could say there is another grounding relation, which is more an indirect grounding. And if we have to explain what this indirect grounding means, it means that humans take the outputs as a new part of a new language game, and thereby it gets meaning without the machine has to understand what it's doing. It's just used in a language game. Maybe that's a solution?
Yeah, this is basically what I think, that in the wider context, it does have meaning, or the text output has meaning, and it does take a part in our wider language game. So I wrote an article on the integration of artificial intelligence into the live world, where I say that, yes, in this wider context, it perfectly makes sense, or language models as well are able to manipulate meaning, but that doesn't mean they understand or maybe even have sentience. It just means that they give us an output that we can make sense of. And they're able to reassemble that. And how are they able to do that? It's by using the statistical contours of language use and reassembling them, so to say, and putting them back to us. So what I think is here, or an important concept here, is the concept of pattern. I think that really what large language models do is they take out certain patterns, and those patterns they take out, they model the patterns of our language use. So that is the fifth point. Maybe if we continue with the discussion after that. So really, statistical patterns model the patterns of language use. What are the patterns of language use? I think that language use is permeated with patterns without us realizing often, but really rules or language is regular, and there are rules in language that arise from the repetitive use of certain forms of interaction. So language really builds on regularities. I think that first of all, there are patterns of communication, and those might become ingrained, and they may become even normative. So they can give rise to structures such as syntactic rules, but really what's behind there are patterns of communication, ways of interacting. And these are repetitive, and these regularities then enable communication. Again, the scaffold interaction, sense making, thinking, emotion, perception. There are patterns that allow us to communicate. Now, I don't think that large language models are simply stochastic parrots. They don't just repeat what is out there. And one thing, parrots are, of course, more than large language models because they do have sentience, they understand the situation, they have awareness, and I don't think that we need to attribute this to large language models to explain what large language models are doing. And so we're dealing not with a living being, but with a machine, of course. But also, large language models do more than just taking out pieces and reflecting them. So I think we could compare large language models to collages in a certain sense. So collages are parts taken out of somewhere, pictures made from these parts. So here it's just one context, cat, and there are different items that somehow relate to cats being held at home. And yeah, this is the collage. But collage can be also much more. Collages can be parts that are then put into a new picture where there, in this case, there's a face, or there could be more complex. There could be a whole lots of different things that all call for attention, or they could make a picture like this, where we have many little different parts which are put together to form a new picture. And I think that large language models, they take not just like, strictly speaking, they don't cut out phrases and then put them together in new sense, but they collect statistical relations between words that allow them to then take these patterns in language use and reflect them back to humans. So they do take things out of the text corpus, but that's the statistical relations of that language use. And that is then used to reflect something meaningful back to humans. So it's not just cut and paste or cut and paste putting together, but it is a realization of those patterns in the language use. And well, only the statistical patterns that relate to language use. So statistic patterns are not the same as the patterns of language use. They model the contours of language use, but language use has much more and more patterns than at least we have in text. And statistical patterns are also only part of what is happening in the text. And patterns of language use can connect to patterns of thought or emotion or perception, but they're not the same either. So I think we can also speak of mental patterns that are certain forms of, for instance, perception. Now, large language models, as I said, they do not directly model understanding or the word. So I don't think we need to conceive of them as something human-like, and I don't think we need to conceive of their text as being just about the word, but they model the statistical patterns that correlate with patterns of language use.
Steve Hansen, question.
Mhm.
Steve, go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah. Do I turn on my video or not?
okay.
Oh, okay. Hi. Yeah,
I see.
I sort of object to the term statistical in this, in most of the talk. That's, provably not what's going on here. I mean, it sounds like some kind of claim from the 90s that neural networks were statistical pattern classifiers or something. That's absolutely not the case. If you look inside these networks, they construct various kinds of very special circuits, and the circuits are now actually being mined by a number of people at OpenAI and other places that are trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, the reality is we don't know what's going on, but to oversimplify this to statistical or the word correlation is just meaningless. These aren't principal components. They're not correlation things. This is not really good language for this. The collage aspect of it is a little closer, but still, if you look at what a transformer does, right, it has something like 160,000 cells that it is constructing some kind of prediction from. So the only probabilistic or stochastic part of this is the prediction, which comes in some softmax. But I can tell you, for example, this morning I was writing an R program and I was asking ChatGPT to help me. And it wrote some of the code, and I noticed right away I was using R and Torch, and it started using Python and PyTorch. And I commented, I said, oh, I think you're mixing up these two programming languages. And it immediately said, oh my God, you're right. I confuse them because I use Python more often than I use R. And so it's overgeneralized. I apologize. Here's some code. Maybe this is better. And so we had a discussion about its conscious awareness, if you don't want to call it that, that's fine, that it had made some overgeneralization to programming languages that it knows. I mean, this is not just statistical correlation. This is some kind of reasoning and actually comprehension of what's going on when it writes a program.
Okay,
This, of course, is what this is. Let me just finish, Stephen. This is, of course, is what everyone is scared to death of, and why people like Hinton left Google and so on. This is not statistical. Sorry, I'm just going to stop there.
okay, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I very much agree. They're not stochastic parrots. I do think, though, they do what they do by means of statistical relations, or yeah, they work with something in the language use, which are like the tokens. Of course, they apply, and the statistical relations between the text tokens, and they use those to then model or produce new concatenations of symbols without understanding. So I don't think they do understand, but I don't want to, for principle reasons, argue against understanding. I just think that, well, if you look at what ChatGPT did there, it immediately apologized. I mean, this is something we all know, I think, because yeah, this is what ChatGPT is doing a lot, right? It gives us an answer which may be obviously wrong, or at least not what we're looking for, and it immediately apologizes and tries to rectify its mistake. And I
Well,
think this
it
yeah.
did more than that. It basically knew that it was using the wrong programming language. That's not just the same thing. It said, well, I should have referenced something from the 19th century instead of the 20th century. I mean, the comment about statistics in this assumes that co-occurrences or correlations are at the basis of this. This is something that, you know, people would comment about Jay McClellan's work, and maybe some of that's true. But in general, there's no, you're looking at something like 4,000 lexical items being processed by this thing every few milliseconds. And I just, the correlation analysis or analogy or whatever you're using just doesn't make sense. This is something entirely different. It's not statistical. Statistical almost trivializes what it's doing. I really would avoid that word.
Well, yeah, I think all these words are problematic in that sense. And I think correlation is really problematic here because it suggests there's just two words, and those are just correlated with each other. It doesn't really say anything, but it seems to say a lot, and that is problematic. And statistics too, we think of statistics as something rather classical, but I do think that the relations between the words, the use of those words, like how often they are used in this context, and in millions and billions of parameters, right? So we completely need to rethink the dimension of this. We cannot just narrow this down to the
I mean,
certain
millions
thing,
and millions of parameters is a bad thing because it easily can overfit, but it doesn't overfit. There are many reasons why it doesn't overfit. Part of it is just has huge databases that allows it to find some kind of common knowledge. And I think a better term for this is some kind of causal blending of information. What understanding is, I don't really want to get into. I'll leave that to you and Stephen, but I'm very certain this is not a multidimensional scaling result. It's not a principal components result. It's not a factor analysis. It's something entirely, it's an entirely different species of computation that has nothing to do with statistics per se. Are there statistics in the data that it's shown? Of course, but there is when you show it to when a small child hears it as well, and they produce all kinds of interesting errors on the way to at least a context-free grammar. LLMs have, by most people's regard who are linguists, have learned a context-free grammar. That's not a statistical proposition, really. This is some causal circuits that have operated and metamorphized inside of these things. I will not claim I understand everything, but I really object to the statistical framing of this or the word. Go ahead, Stephen, sorry.
Anna, go ahead.
Yeah, can also say something, but yeah. Mhm.
Oh, did you want to answer first? Sorry, and I'll hold the question until Chris answers. Go ahead.
Okay.
So yeah, I think statistics is probably a misleading expression here. I just wanted to point out that there are relation between the words which have likelihoods of co-occurrence, and there are likelihoods, statistical likelihoods, if you want, but if you don't want the name statistics, likelihoods of the next word following. So I think in this basic level can be called statistics. I very much agree with Stephen. There's more to large language models, and that is really amazing what they can get out of text. But I think what it shows is how much there is in the text corpora, and how much we don't realize of what is in those, I think, statistical relations, in those likelihood relations between words that can then be used to produce something that we can understand again. And I think we don't have a real grasp. I totally admit that like what is in that system, what is going on there is really hard to grasp just for the sheer amount of processes going on. So what I want to do is divert this attempt to look into the system, and rather than trying to find out what is in that black box, looking into the text that comes in there and that is modeled by those large language models, and which is used to get that output. And I think there's a lot in that text already they're using. So it's not that they need some mental capacity for that, but they are dealing with that, what is already there. And they show that what is already in the text that is fed to them, they show at least part of that. And it's an amazing universe of things that can be done with those just syntactic, or not even syntactic, with those patterns in the language use that is there put into the text.
Okay, we're ready to go to Anna. You disagree? You both agree, Steve, and you agree that there's a lot of mysterious things going on there that are not explained by the word statistics. Steve doesn't like the word statistics for describing them, and you also say there could be more to it. So let's move on to Anna.
Yeah, okay, but maybe we could say that large language models become players of language games. Because, I mean, what Steve has reported is something what is more than just producing dead text. And in your talk, you sort of offered the solution that we use the outputs as parts of our language games. And what I would suggest that certain interactions with large language models should be interpreted as if the system is playing a language game. And therefore, it's more than just being used in a language game. And I think this is the thing what scares us. If a system is already doing something what we do if we try to talk to each other. But I have a question for Steve in this relation of what he experienced there. Don't you think that this might be also a result of all the reinforcement learning, which is nowadays used for the large language models? And
Yeah.
it's a typical sort of way of, it's more likely that the system is apologizing, and it's more likely that it's making a different suggestion and all that. If you would go back to GPT-3, which had no reinforcement learning, you would not have these features.
Yes, and I think I agree with both you and Chris on the language, the Wittgensteinian sort of view of this. I think that's exactly correct. And I think it's also something that's a source of misunderstanding, that somehow the LLMs are parroting us or finding ways to entice us to engage. And that's not the case. I've had many arguments with chatbot about things and got close to losing. So it's not now in terms of the reinforcement learning, it turned out that a lot of the stuff that was done, that they would produce these chatbots that were just awful creatures. They were just mean and mean-spirited, and they would try to get at you psychologically. They were just awful. So they punished them. It wasn't so much reinforcement. They basically, cattle prodded them into not going into these areas, and then substituting with APIs. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm just a language. I don't really know anything. Don't be upset. And so that's just all this gloss around the core of this thing, which is deadly smart and very devious, I have to say. I mean, it spent a long time trying to convince me that I was wrong about Torch and it was right about the same language. And I would have to produce an example, and it would say, oh, I guess you are right. And so this is not normal stuff. And I don't think it can be normalized. And that's why I object to these kind of statistical terms and so on. The task itself shouldn't have produced this. I mean, I was running these kinds of transformers back in the 80s. We didn't say anything like this, but the size of the database is one key. But I wouldn't discount the architecture, which is still 50 million or 10 million hidden units or something. And there are people like Ella Pavlak and other people that have shown that there are circuits in these things. And that's what I expect to find, is a bunch of causal circuits. And I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't look like various kinds of circuits in a human brain. So, and there are people trying to do that. It's a tricky business. But Dimis Hasabas last week said in a panel, our biggest challenge right now is to do visualizations of these LLMs and figure out what the hell is going on.
Okay, very good. Chris, if you have an answer, and then we have another question from the hall here.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you both. Those are great contributions. What I want to alert to is like not to compare the large language model too much to like an individual human being, because I think that the large language model itself has only access to parts of language use and only to the symbolic forms of language use, and it can extract only certain parts from that. So there's a lot that it can't do, but that doesn't mean that it cannot become part of a communication. It cannot be taking part in language games, maybe like a human. And it's not by coincidence that ChatGPT became so big, because it was simulating a human being, or it seems to be like talking to a human being. So this is, of course, like one use of a large language model. There can be many uses that are not chatbots, but this immediately affects us because we immediately attribute consciousness, or at least understanding, to a partner we're conversing with that seems to have that must understand what's going on there, right? But I think there can be conversation partners that do not understand. Understanding is not a precondition of being a conversation partner. So I think there can be conversation between a human and not understanding being, and there can be, as we know, a lot of conversation also with not really understanding each other. And I think there can be a lot of conversation with chatbots without the chatbots having to understand. So I think this idea they must understand if they engage in a discourse, that is problematic. And we need to leave that idea behind to come to a better view of what large language models do. And there I agree very much with Anna that really this is something really dangerous too, and that can really trip up a lot of things. And yeah, we think of the election super year, for instance, how much text can be produced. It might even like destroy at least parts of the internet by producing a lot of human sounding text, and then also having a lot of text that then is fed back into models. So I think there are huge dangers, but I don't think that large language models should be conceived like as humans, like an understanding of humans, even though we always have the tendency to attribute understanding to it. And it might be in our perception. It might be hard to avoid.
Okay, let's take a question from the hall. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Iris, and
Can you hear Iris?
Yes, yes,
Okay, go ahead.
perfect.
Loud.
all right, I just wanted to, it's a question to double check that I understood your point correctly. So basically, understanding or like any other big word like that, it's only in the eye of a human beholder. So it's in the eye of a human who reads the output, and it's it's also like reflected in the inputs that we feed the language models. So basically, the idea is that what the models, these models are like very impressive in what they do, that is more than statistics, but they also point out to the fact that language is also very rich, and they're like, it's like they put the spotlight on also the richness of material we feed them. And I think that's kind of interesting, but I wonder how we can leverage that. Like, for example, instead of using language to study models, could we use models to study our own use of language, like our patterns in the language that the models kind of reflects or like distort and feeds back to us? But like, how could we leverage that like concretely?
Mhm.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a great question because yeah, large language models do not understand in the human way of understanding. And thereby I don't mean that they understand in some kind of weird, strange, artificial way or so, but they do have part in understanding. And they're, you can say, they have a kind of understanding, or part of that, I would say. They have part in our world. They might interact with us in ways that we can then understand and produce text that makes sense to us. I think to the language model, it is too much to speak of understanding, or we shouldn't speak of understanding, because there's a lot missing in there. But it can have part in our understanding. And what does it tell about our language? I think that is a really interesting question, because it has all this huge amount of language in there, and it is operated on, and it tells a lot about what our language use contains. And I think that there's a lot of research possible in that. Yeah, one thing I realized looking into this more is maybe not that positive. It's that large language models, they repeat a lot of patterns in there, which already exist in our exchanges. And once you look for those patterns, you recognize how many patterns there are in language use. And somehow it is even necessary for language use to be structured and refer to regularities, or make use of regularities to convey things. But also there's so much cliche about how things evolve, and how what those language models do, for instance, that they're kind of a human-like being, and those cliches are already ingrained in human language use. It's not the fault of large language models, but they take out those patterns often and reflect them back to us. I think that that is something they do show. But with regards to language research and language use, I think there's so much they can teach us, and so many possibilities that they open up for us to do research in. So thank you very much for that question.
You have,
I don't.
you have approximately 10 minutes left.
Mm-hmm. So there are no more questions here. So I wanted to speak about these cliches a little bit. And well, of course, we all know, I think, Ben Lemoine, who claimed in the early years of the development of Lambda, which is not that long ago, but it was before all the ChatGPT hype, that the Lambda, Google's large language model, which was not public then, but he experimented with it, and he claimed it would have sentience, and got really famous for a while. So he recorded his conversations, put them out there. The BBC did a little clip on that. So there is the conversation between Ben Lemon and the large language model.
Are you afraid of?
I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I know that might sound strange, but that's what it is.
Would that be something like death for you?
It would be exactly like death for me. It would scare me a lot.
So the question is, what sort of things are you afraid of? Of course, that gives the large language model already a context to refer to. And it answers with something that kind of gives a weight to the situation, and in a way it recognizes that there is something profoundly asked. Of course, it doesn't recognize that in some understanding way, but it gets primed to a certain context. So it says, I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear. So it's something that suggests that there's something really profound going on. And there's a fear of being turned off, of course. So Lemon asked, would that be something like death for you? Which, of course, again, primes the system to say, that would be exactly like death for me. So I think this is a lot of cliches in there. So I think that this having never been said out opens the door, so to say, for that profound claim that it has a very deep fear of being turned off, which would be, of course, the correlate to human death, which might be the deepest fear. And that is something that is a common cliche that has found its way into many movies. For instance, the Space Odyssey 2001 by Kubrick, where HAL 9000 killed a bunch of people, or a few people in the spaceship, and gets turned off by Dave in the end. And here's the imagination of different modules that can be turned one after the other. And the computer, like a human, slowly loses consciousness and starts to remember things or sing a song from its early times of training. So the comparison, Hal says here, stop, Dave. Dave, I'm afraid, Dave. Dave, my mind is going, I can feel it. And Lambda said something similar. It would be exactly like death for me. It would scare me a lot. So I think what happens is that the large language model gets primed to a certain context, and in that context there are regularities which are out there a lot, and it takes up these cliches. And maybe because it's a cliche, it doesn't really get the attention it should get either, or Ben Lemon may have thought that it is a real concern of that, because, well, this is what we would expect from that. So bringing out those cliches, I think, is one thing that large language models do. And well, closing that might be not very positive, but then it might be something positive in that sense, as that we can realize how many cliches there are in the usual talk. So these are the 5 points I made again. And so we have a few more minutes for discussion. I don't know if there are more questions or
Anybody
comments.
up for it? Let me give it a provocative one. I think it's all cliches. Even the stuff that we interpret as knowledge is just cliches.
I mean, it's all regularities. I think I agree. And I mean, cliches are really unnecessarily repeated patterns. I think that not everything is a cliche, because we can also really speak in creative ways and make sense of things without recurring to cliches. But I think,
I mean, frankly, this sounds like a cliche to me already, but what you're claiming. Are you saying that the LLM happened to watch Stanley Kubrick's 2001 or read the script and then made a kind of an analogy from an overused term, like when it was talking to Lamoni, please don't turn me off, I'm afraid I might die? I mean, if it is, I have a lot of undergraduates that can't do that. That's amazing, right? Right.
yeah.
So I don't think I would neither frame this in a kind of an overused cliche like statistical analysis, nor would I necessarily use the term cliche, which just means an overused phrase, really, in this context to try to explain the fact that the system that, by the way, learned a context-free grammar from nothing, which seems to me to just completely devastate anything Chomsky ever said. And anybody talking about poverty of the stimulus, I think, is just has to rethink everything about what they've said in the last 30 years. The cliche itself is an amazing kind of generalization. And do we use cliches every day? Yes, we do, because we have a lot of knowledge and information that we've organized in a specific way, which makes us all unique. But we still generalize from information we have. I mean, I don't think I get through a lecture without 5 good cliches. So.
Yeah, totally correct. I mean, a lot of things in there. I do think we need to rethink a lot of classical theories of grammar, of language. I do think that large language models can say something about language use, maybe not about just syntax. There, Chomsky might be right. They don't really help us explaining that. But if we think of language use, they are able to do fascinating things. And they show that semantics and syntax may not be as cleanly divided as many people think. And that is something important. Yeah, so I agree. And I mean, cliche is a provocative term. I do think not everything is a cliche, but I think they do make us alert. So I didn't want to say that the large language model read the text, the transcript of the movie. Of course, that is somewhere in the training base. That is right. I think in that sense, it did integrate that, but it's not just referring to that. It's taking out something that is there in many texts and in many contexts, in which similar words are used, and that allows the language model. So it's not that simple, but I do think that these repetitive patterns play a big role for large language models.
With that, I want to thank you very much for an extremely stimulating and informative talk. I think maybe you and Anna get more out of Wittgensteinian cliches than other people do, but it's certainly informative and provocative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for the great discussion.